The blizzard came without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment, the sky above Dakota Territory held the flat gray of an ordinary January afternoon, and the next it simply ceased to exist, replaced by a wall of white moving south from Canada, with the momentum of something that had been building for 1,000 miles and had no intention of stopping for anything as insignificant as human life. Eli Hatch saw it coming from the ridge above Ridge Creek, and he did not waste time on fear. He counted heads instead. 23 when they'd left town that morning. 19 now because 4 had gone down in the last 2 hours and could not be brought up again, and the ones still moving were doing so with the mechanical repetition of people who had stopped thinking about survival as a choice and started experiencing it as a reflex. He was carrying a child on his back, a girl 3 years old, the daughter of a woman named Dottie Pierce, who was still walking 30 feet ahead of him, but walking wrong, listing to the left, her right arm wrapped around her own middle as though she were trying to hold herself together from the outside. The child had stopped crying an hour ago. That was worse than the crying. Eli had grown up on a farm in Ohio where they raised hogs, and he knew the difference between an animal that was suffering loudly and an animal that had gone quiet because it had moved past suffering into something else entirely. He shifted the girl higher on his back and kept moving. Harlan Voss was at the front of the line, which was where commissioners put themselves when witnesses were present. He had argued twice for turning back. Eli had refused twice, not with words, but with the simple and unanswerable logic of a man who kept walking in the right direction while the person giving orders stood still. The second time, Voss had grabbed Eli's arm. Eli had looked at the hand on his sleeve with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned that some men confuse volume with authority, then continued walking. Voss had followed. There was nothing else to do. The ridge they were crossing looked identical to every other ridge within sight. Brown grass buried under 2 feet of drifted snow, the occasional dark spine of a fence post jutting up at wrong angles, the landscape erased of all feature and specificity by the storm until the world consisted of nothing but white and cold and the next 6 feet of ground in front of your face. Eli had been watching that ground for 3 days. He had noted the way snow behaved differently in different places, the way it lay heavy and uniform over open field, but skimmed thin and restless over certain hillsides, the way particular slopes shed their covering faster than they should have given the wind direction. He had been a carpenter for 12 years, which meant he had spent 12 years reading surfaces for what they concealed beneath them, and the ridge above the old Callaway claim had been bothering him since they'd passed it the first time yesterday morning. The snow on the north face of that ridge was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not wrong in a way that would register for anyone not specifically looking for it, but wrong in the precise way that mattered. It was thinner than the surrounding terrain by a margin that the wind alone could not explain. Heat does that to snow, heat rising from below. He was still turning this observation over in his mind when the hillside opened. It happened without preamble or sound, a section of earth simply parting along a seam that had been invisible a heartbeat before, swinging outward on hinges that moved with the smoothness of something carefully maintained. The light that came through was warm yellow, the color of a fire that had been burning steadily for a long time, and it fell across the snow with a quality so foreign to everything surrounding it that Eli stopped walking mid-step. The child on his back went rigid, then completely still. The crying she had abandoned an hour ago did not return. Instead, she made a small sound in the back of her throat, a sound that was not fear and not relief, but something located between the two. The sound a creature makes when it recognizes safety before its mind has caught up to what its body already knows. A woman stood in the opening. She was not tall. Her hair dark once and still, mostly so, had gone silver at the temples, and along the part, the kind of silver that comes not from age alone, but from sustained and particular hardship. Her eyes were gray-blue, the color of winter sky at the flat hour before dawn, and they were narrowed slightly against her own lamplight, because those eyes had spent a long time in the dark and had adjusted to conditions that no longer included this much illumination. Her hands wrapped around the doorframe were the hands of someone who had been doing serious physical work for years. The knuckles enlarged the skin across the back of each hand, showing the history of every cold morning she had ever survived. She looked at the line of people behind Eli with an expression that was not surprise. It was assessment. "Come in," she said. "There's room for all of you." That was January of 1890. The door in the hillside had been there for 8 years. The woman standing in it had been declared dead 4 times. Her name was Wren Calloway, and to understand how she came to be living 30 feet beneath the feet of the man who had spent the better part of a decade trying to erase her from the surface of the earth, you have to go back to the autumn of 1882. When she was 26 years old, her husband was still alive. The world still operated according to rules she believed in, and a fence hinge in a horse barn broke in a way that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. The Black Hills foothills in September hold a specific quality of light that does not exist anywhere else on the continent. It comes in low from the southwest and turns the dry grass a color somewhere between copper and fire, and the hills themselves seem to breathe in it, to expand slightly with warmth, before the cold that is always waiting just over the Canadian border settles in for another winter. Wren had noticed this light in their first September on the claim, and had noticed it every September since, which meant she had noticed it exactly 3 times before Silas Calloway died, and she stopped being the kind of person who noticed light. He was fixing the barn hinge when she first understood, without yet having words for the understanding that she loved him in a way that was structural rather than decorative. She had married him in St. Louis at 23, the daughter of a Missouri farming family that had done well enough to survive, but never well enough to stop worrying about survival. And she had married him because he was steady, and because steadiness was not a quality she had grown up surrounded by. 3 years on the claim had confirmed the wisdom of that particular instinct. Silas Calloway was the kind of man who did not raise his voice because he did not need to, who fixed things instead of complaining about them, who expressed his entire emotional life through the quality of his attention to the task in front of him. The hinge was a cast iron piece they'd bought from a hardware man in Ridge Creek, and it had been improperly hung from the start set at a fraction of a degree off plumb, so that over time the weight of the barn door had worked the mounting bolts loose. Silas had noticed it on Monday. It was now Thursday. He had spent the intervening days finishing a commission for a neighboring rancher, a set of gate hinges that were not his priority but were someone else's money. And so the barn hinge waited its turn with the patience that inanimate objects have no choice but to demonstrate. When he finally got to it, the bolt he needed sheared off cleanly under the wrench, the metal fatigued past its tolerance. He held the broken piece up, examined it with the unhurried attention he gave to everything, and set it down. He went to his forge, heated a repair piece, worked it into shape in about 20 minutes, and set the new bolt with the kind of precision that is only possible in someone for whom precision has become entirely automatic. But the hinge itself needed to be reset, the mount re-drilled to correct the original error. And while he was doing that work, he spoke to Wren, who was handing him tools and holding the door steady. He said, "The thing that's broken isn't always the thing that failed. Usually it's the thing that was wrong from the start and just finally gave out." Then he set the hinge, tested the swing, and said, "Broken thing still holds if you know where to put the weight." He was talking about the hinge. Wren knew that. She filed it away anyway, the way you file away the last ordinary thing a person says before everything changes. Not because you know it will be the last ordinary thing, but because something in the body records certain moments with a fidelity that the conscious mind never manages. 2 weeks later, the fever arrived in Ridge Creek Township. It came from the east, riding the same wagon roads that brought everything else to a territory in the process of convincing itself it was civilization. It presented first as an ordinary autumn illness, the kind that took a week and left you thin and grateful. And by the time it revealed its actual nature, it had already moved through 3 households and was working on a 4th. The Territorial Health Office, which existed primarily on paper, sent a notice suggesting residents avoid unnecessary contact with affected neighbors. The notice arrived on a Saturday. Silas Calloway began showing symptoms on Sunday. Wren had read about typhoid fever in one of the almanacs they kept on the shelf beside the window, the kind of almanac that covered crop rotation and weather patterns, but also devoted a section to common frontier illnesses, because people who lived 50 miles from the nearest physician needed to know these things. She knew the progression. She understood what the 4th day meant. She did not allow herself to understand it until it was happening, because understanding it earlier would have consumed energy she needed for the nursing, and Silas needed the nursing more than Wren needed to grieve. He was gone on the 4th day. Tuesday morning, just after the light changed from black to gray, with Wren's hand in his, and the sound of the wind moving around the corners of the cabin they had built together in their first summer on the claim, when they had been so new to everything that even the mistakes felt like accomplishments. She sat with him for an hour. Then she stood up, went to the barn, found the sharpest shovel, and began the problem of burying her husband in ground that had already started to freeze. The difficulty was not metaphorical. October in Dakota Territory means the top 3 inches of soil have gone hard as packed clay, and below that, the earth surrenders its heat reluctantly, degree by degree, fighting the cold, the way something fights when it has no choice but to fight. Wren drove the shovel into the ground behind the cabin and felt the impact travel up through the handle into her palms, her wrists, her elbows, her shoulders, the shock of solid resistance that told her this would take longer than she had. She built a fire on the frozen ground, waited for the heat to soften. A few inches of soil scraped those inches away with a flat iron tool and built another fire. The process repeated through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. Her hands blistered before dark. The blisters broke before midnight. By the time the grave was deep enough, she could no longer feel the difference between the shovel handle and her own skin, which had become something other than what it had been at the start. No one came. She had sent word to Dottie Pierce by way of a ranch hand passing on the road, a folded note asking if Dottie could come, knowing already what the answer would be because the fever had every household in the township locked behind its own door with its own terror. Dottie's reply came back by the same route, a single line on the back of Wren's own note because paper was not wasted on the frontier. Cannot come. Fever's at the Hendersons, too. God keep you both. Wren read it standing at the edge of the half-dug grave, folded it into her coat pocket, and went back to work. She buried Silas in the quilt from their bed, the one they'd brought from Missouri, blue and white, in a pattern his mother had made, and that still smelled if you pressed your face into it and refused to be reasonable faintly of the house where he'd grown up. She lowered him in alone. No one read scripture. The cold was the only thing present, and it paid attention to everything equally. She filled the grave. She placed a cross of cottonwood. She did not cry because something in the mechanism that processes grief had been overwhelmed by the hours of digging and had simply ceased to function the way a pump ceases when you ask it to move more water than it was built to handle. She would not cry again for years, and when she finally did, it would not be for Silas, but for the old woman who taught her to disappear. And by then, the crying itself would feel like something she had forgotten how to do and was relearning from the beginning. 3 mornings after the burial, Harlan Voss rode up to the cabin. He came with 2 men, a territorial land attorney named Prentice Ogden, who wore spectacles and carried a leather case, and had the careful, conserving movements of someone who has spent his life making sure other people took the risks, and a surveyor named Bodell who said nothing and measured everything with an exactitude that suggested he had learned long ago that accuracy was the only thing keeping him employed. Voss himself rode a bay horse that was too good for the territory, the kind of animal that announces its owner's belief in his own distinction. He was 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that looks authoritative in the way geological formations look authoritative, not because of anything they decided, but because of what they were made of and how long they had been there. He was the Commissioner of Land Affairs for the Northern District of Dakota Territory, which meant he was the person who decided whether homestead claims were being properly developed, who issued or revoked the permits on which most of the territory's economic activity depended, and who had, over the course of 20 years in this position, accumulated a level of local influence that made the distinction between his personal interests and the public good largely theoretical. Wren had met him once before at a land office meeting in Ridge Creek, and had formed no particular opinion of him beyond a general wariness of men who wear authority the way other men wear good boots constantly, and with the expectation that others will notice. He did not dismount. He told her that her husband's claim on the 160 acres was subject to a prior encumbrance, specifically a financial instrument signed by Silas Calloway 2 years previous, which Ogden produced from his leather case, with the efficiency of a man who has retrieved this document many times and expects to retrieve it several more. Wren took the paper, which was printed in small type on both sides, with the kind of language that has been deliberately made difficult to understand because clarity would make it easier to challenge. She read it twice. The main text described an agricultural improvement loan, a common enough arrangement for homesteaders who needed capital for equipment or seed. But in the final paragraph in type that was noticeably smaller than everything preceding it and set off from the surrounding text by a margin that made it look like a footnote rather than a condition, was the operative clause. Upon default or death of the signing party, all mineral extraction rights, surface rights, and development rights associated with the described property revert immediately and unconditionally to Voss Copper Holdings, a corporation registered in the territory. Voss Copper Holdings, his own company. The loan had not been agricultural assistance. It had been a mechanism for acquiring mineral rights to land that Voss had already known, from a geological survey conducted the previous year, contained a copper vein of significant commercial value running directly beneath the North Ridge. The loan had been structured to be difficult to repay, with compounding terms that a man focused on farming would not necessarily recognize until the repayment period was already closing. If the borrower died before repayment was complete, which in this territory was not an unlikely outcome, the acquisition became immediate. Wren looked up from the document at Voss on his horse. "My husband's signature is on this," she said. "Not a question." "It is." Voss's voice carried the particular register of a man explaining something to someone he does not expect to understand it fully. He signed something he didn't read. He signed a legal instrument that was explained to him at the time of signing. Wren looked at the signature. She knew Silas's handwriting the way she knew the sound of his breathing, the specific pressure of his particular hand, the way the S in Silas always ran slightly long, as though making space for the rest of the name to follow. The signature was his. The document around it was not what he had believed he was signing. She understood this not from legal expertise, but from knowing Silas Calloway, from understanding that a man who spent 3 years reading the land with the care and attention he had given this claim would not have knowingly transferred away the rights to what he was building. She handed the document back to Ogden. "The land is mine," she said. "I've been working this claim for 3 years. The dwelling is built. The acreage is improved. The Homestead Act is superseded by the prior encumbrance." Voss said it with the patience of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. "You're welcome to petition the land office for a review. In the meantime, you'll want to make arrangements. Winter comes early up here." He glanced at the North Ridge, the long slope of it, covered in good grass, the timber stands visible along the upper edge. He looked at that timber with an expression Wren had seen before on the faces of men at livestock auctions, the expression of someone doing private arithmetic. He turned his horse to go. Ogden and Bodell turned with him. Voss said something to Ogden, not quietly enough and not loudly enough, his voice calibrated with the unconscious precision of a man accustomed to being overheard only when he chose to be. Except the wind off the Black Hills is unpredictable in autumn's shifting direction without warning, carrying sound in ways that the person producing it cannot always anticipate. The wind shifted at exactly the wrong moment for Harlan Voss. Wren heard the copper survey puts the main vein under the North Ridge. We need access by spring, or the Philadelphia investors pull their commitment. She heard Ogden's response, something about timelines and legal proceedings. She heard Voss again, his voice dropping, but not enough. If she's still here by March, that becomes a different kind of problem. She stood in front of the cabin until they were shapes on the horizon. She stood there after they became nothing at all. The wind moved across 160 acres of land that held her husband's body, and 3 years of their labor, and a copper vein she had not known existed until 40 seconds ago. And Wren Calloway understood with the clarity that comes only when every comfortable illusion has been stripped away at once what she was dealing with. This was not a legal dispute. This was a removal. The document was the mechanism. The winter was the timeline. She was the obstacle. She went inside. She went to see the circuit judge in Ridge Creek first, a man named Farwell, who heard land disputes on the second Tuesday of each month. She rode 12 miles on a horse whose shoes needed replacing, arriving with a folder containing the original homestead, filing the improvement records she had kept since their first season, and a written account of the discrepancies she had identified in Voss's document. Judge Farwell listened to her for 4 minutes before informing her that he could not adjudicate matters involving prior encumbrances on homestead claims, as those fell under the authority of the Territorial Land Commissioner. The Territorial Land Commissioner was Harlan Voss. The circularity of this was not lost on Wren. She did not say so. She thanked Farwell for his time and rode back the way she had come. She went to see Reverend Thomas Alcott at the First Congregational Church of Ridge Creek because the church had influence and Alcott had the respect of the community, and because Wren was still operating at this stage on the assumption that legitimate authority applied to her situation in the same way it applied to everyone else's. Alcott received her in his study, which smelled of pipe tobacco and lemon oil, with a framed letter from the St. Paul Diocesan Council on one wall and a photograph of the church's building fund committee on another. Harlan Voss in the back row third from the left, looking directly at the camera. Alcott listened to Wren's account. He expressed sympathy. He suggested that a young widow in her circumstances would be best served by seeking remarriage, as the frontier was not designed for solitary women, and that perhaps Providence was indicating through these difficult circumstances a change of direction. Wren looked at the photograph. She looked at Alcott. She understood that there was no daylight between these two men on the question of what should become of Wren Calloway and the North Ridge. She left without finishing the tea she hadn't wanted in the first place. Dottie Pierce lived 3 miles east of the Calloway claim, a woman of 32 with 3 children and enough land to sustain them if nothing went wrong, which on the frontier meant a constant negotiation with probability. Wren and Dottie had been friends in the particular way that geography creates friendships. On the plains, 2 women close enough to reach each other in emergencies and far enough that every visit required intention. Dottie's friendship was real. Wren had not doubted it before this visit and did not doubt it during, which made what happened worse than if she had. Dottie opened the door and Wren saw immediately that she already knew. News on the frontier moves the way water moves, finding every crack and gap, and Voss's visit to the Calloway claim had been visible from the road. Dottie's face held the specific anguish of someone who wants to help and has already decided not to. Before Wren could finish explaining what she needed, a single witness willing to testify that the claim was being actively worked, Dottie went to the table and produced a document of her own. It was a notice of permit review for the water rights associated with Dottie's land, the creek access, that made her acreage viable as a farm. The notice was dated 2 weeks prior. It bore Voss's office letterhead. It had been delivered to Dottie's door 3 days before Silas died, which meant Voss had anticipated this conversation and had prepared for it before the body was in the ground. He came himself, Dottie said, to tell me the review was pending. He said it was routine, but he said it while looking at me like he was explaining something I should understand without being told. Her hands were not shaking from cold. If I stand against him, Wren, he takes the water. My kids can't survive the summer without that creek. Wren looked at the notice. She looked at her friend's face, at the guilt moving through it like weather. She thought about what it would mean to have 3 children and no water in a Dakota summer. She thought about what it meant that Voss had taken the time to make this visit before Silas was even sick enough to be certain of dying, which meant the copper survey had told him something reliable enough to invest preparation in. I understand, Wren said. She meant it. She meant it the way you can mean something fully and still feel the weight of it pressing down on your chest. She walked home in the dark. The decision did not arrive dramatically. It was not a moment of clarity or resolution or the kind of internal turning point that announces itself. It was more like what happens when water reaches the temperature at which it changes state, a threshold crossed not through choice, but through accumulation, degree by degree, until the thing that was one thing becomes another thing entirely. She stood in the cabin that night with the lamp burning and the ticking of the small clock Silas had brought from Ohio and the sound of the wind doing what the wind does in Dakota in October, which is move across everything with the indifference of something that has never needed permission to be anywhere. She understood what her options were. Leave the land. Sell it if Voss would allow a sale rather than a forced transfer. Find a man willing to take on a widow and a disputed claim. Fight through channels that had already demonstrated they were not her channels, that had been arranged carefully and in advance to route any complaint she made back to the man causing the complaint. None of those were options. They were the forms that surrender took when it wanted to look like choice. She went to the window and looked at the North Ridge. The copper was there whether she was or not. Voss knew it. She knew it now. The land had value that had nothing to do with her or Silas or 3 years of work and care. The land had value because of what was under it, and that was the thing that would kill her if she let it. Not the cold, not the isolation, but the simple geological fact that something valuable existed beneath her feet, and she had no way to protect it through any of the mechanisms the world had provided for that purpose. She could not fight what she could see. Everything she had tried had confirmed that. But perhaps the question was not whether she could fight what could be seen. The first week of November brought a frost that killed the last of the grass color and left the hills looking like old iron, cold and gray-brown, and stripped of anything that could be called warmth. Wren was splitting firewood behind the cabin on a Tuesday morning when she became aware that she was being watched. She had developed over 3 years on the claim the particular sensitivity to observation that comes from living in open country where another human being at any distance is visible from a long way off. This was different. This was someone who had gotten close without her noticing, which on open ground meant they had not wanted to be noticed until they chose to be. She turned. At the edge of the tree line, not moving, stood an old woman. She was Lakota. This registered first as fact, then as context. Lakota people had been the primary inhabitants of this land before the treaties and the removals, and the Homestead Acts had reclassified their presence from ownership to trespass, a reclassification accomplished through exactly the kind of documents Wren was currently fighting. The woman was old in the way that certain things are old, not diminished by time, but compressed by it, made more specific and more themselves. She moved when she decided to move, which was after Wren had put down the axe, and she moved through the frost-killed grass with a silence that was not absence of sound, but rather a quality of presence so complete that it left no room for the sound of movement. "You're standing in the open like a deer in a clearing," the woman said. Her English was precise, each word given its full weight. "Every man who wants what you have can see exactly where you are." Wren's hands tightened on the axe handle before she consciously decided to pick it up again. "Who are you?" "My people had a name for me that your tongue can't manage. The settlers who have seen me call me Two Stones Woman." A pause. "Names are what other people use for you. They don't tell you what you need to know." She looked past Wren at the cabin at the north ridge behind it, at the timber on the upper slope. Her expression when it reached the timber was not possessive. It was something closer to grief, the old kind, the kind that has been carried so long it no longer announces itself, but simply exists as a quality of how the person moves through the world. "I have been watching your ridge for 40 years. I watched it when it belonged to my people. I watched when the survey men came. I watched when your husband filed his papers." She looked back at Wren. "I watched when the commissioner came 3 mornings after the burial. You saw that. I see most things that happen on this ridge. That is what 40 years of watching teaches you." She tilted her head slightly. "The question is whether you are going to stand in the open until you freeze, or whether you want to learn what the land already knows how to do." Wren looked at this woman who had appeared from the tree line without sound, who had watched this ridge for 4 decades, who had seen what the land beneath her feet had meant to different people at different times, and who was offering something that Wren did not yet understand, but recognized with the animal part of her mind that processed information faster than language could follow, as the only thing anyone had offered her that was not another form of the same door closing. "What does the land know how to do?" Wren asked. Two Stones Woman's expression shifted. It was a small change, a movement around the eyes, the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the right question for a long time. "It knows how to hide things," she said. "It has been hiding things since before any man thought to put his name on it. Come, I will show you." She walked toward the north ridge without checking to see if Wren followed. Wren followed. 2 miles through the frost-killed grass, moving along the base of the ridge, in a direction that felt wrong at first, and then felt like the only direction that made sense, as though the land itself had a preferred approach and they were finally using it. Two Stones Woman walked without looking at the ground, which meant she did not need to look at it, which meant she had been walking this specific path for longer than Wren had been alive. She pointed out things as they moved, the way water would drain in spring, which hollows would flood, which slopes would hold their footing through mud season, which aspects faced weather and which were protected from it. She was not teaching in the way a classroom teaches. She was showing the way someone shows who understands that certain knowledge cannot enter through the ears alone, but must be walked into the body through the feet. They came to a hillside that looked to Wren's eyes like every other hillside on the claim. Brown grass in the particular density that north-facing slopes produced a slight concavity in the terrain that might have been natural erosion or might have been something else. Two Stones Woman crouched, reached into the grass at a spot that bore no visible marking, and lifted. The sod came up in a section hinged on one side by roots that had been trained rather than cut opening to reveal a passage descending at a gentle angle into earth that smelled of soil and cold stone and the faint remainder of wood smoke. The air that rose from it was warmer than the air above. Not dramatically warmer, but the difference was immediate and unmistakable, the kind of warmth that means something is not absent, but present, sustained, reliable. Wren crouched at the opening. She looked down into the dark that the passage led into the dark that opened as her eyes adjusted into a space that was not a hole, but a room. Walls of packed earth held in place by timber framing she could not yet fully see. A floor that had been worked smooth by use over time. The smell of a place that had been inhabited. My grandmother built the first room, Two Stones woman said. My mother added to it. I added more. She was not looking at Wren. She was looking at the hillside above, at the grass moving in the wind, at the surface of the world that would reveal nothing about what existed beneath it. The earth keeps a temperature, 52 degrees in winter, the same in summer. The cold outside does not matter. The soldiers who looked for us looked with their eyes. They looked for smoke. They looked for footprints. They looked for the signs that people leave when they live above the ground. She turned to Wren then. We did not live above the ground. Wren looked at the room beneath the prairie. She felt the warmth rising from it. She thought about the cabin standing on the surface of her claim, visible from the road, visible from the ridge, visible to anyone who came looking from any direction, announcing her presence, to anyone who had a reason to want to know where she was. She thought about Voss on his horse, looking at the timber with the expression of a man who had already spent the money he hadn't yet collected. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of problem that winters out here had a way of solving. The cottonwood for the main beams, she said, because it resists rot. Two Stones woman looked at her with the attention of someone reassessing a first impression. Yes, the old woman said. And the entrance on the north face, because the south face gets enough sun to kill the grass cover. A pause. You understand the problem before I explain the solution. Wren looked at the framing visible in the passage. The joints were fitted with a precision she recognized from watching Silas work metal, the principle of interlocking load distribution, where force increases the grip rather than working against it. The same principle, different materials, the same understanding of how weight wanted to move and how to use that movement rather than fight it. Can you teach me to build one? Wren asked. Two Stones woman looked at the ridge. She looked at the timber on the upper slope that Voss wanted by spring. She looked at the woman crouching at the entrance to a room that her grandmother had built and her mother had extended and she had used and maintained and was now for the first time in her memory considering passing forward. I can teach you everything, Two Stones woman said, but you have to be willing to give up the world above. Wren thought about the cabin. She thought about the cross over Silas's grave visible from the road. She thought about every institution she had approached in the past week and what each of them had shown her about what she could expect from the world above. There's nothing left in the world above that I need to keep, she said. It was the truest thing she had said since her husband died. Two Stones woman stood. She looked at the horizon the way someone looks who has seen many horizons and stopped expecting them to hold anything surprising, but looks anyway because the looking is its own kind of discipline. Then we start tomorrow, she said. Before the ground freezes hard, we have maybe 6 weeks before the work becomes impossible. She began walking back along the base of the ridge, following the path that felt like the only direction. Your hands are going to bleed. Wren looked down at her palms at the blisters from the grave digging that had not yet fully healed. She thought about everything those hands had done in the past 2 weeks and everything they were apparently going to be asked to do next. They already have, she said. She followed the old woman back through the frost-killed grass while the last of the copper light faded from the hills and the wind off Canada began to say what it always said in October in Dakota Territory, which was that what was coming would not ask anyone's permission and would not stop for anything as small and temporary as a human life, and that the only real question, the only question that had ever mattered out here was what you planned to do about that. The work began before dawn and ended after dark, and did not stop for weather or exhaustion, or the particular grief that has no name, because it is not sadness exactly, but the total reorganization of a life around an absence. Two Stones woman arrived each morning from wherever she came from, which Wren never asked about, because the old woman would not have answered, and she taught the way the land itself taught through demonstration, through consequence, through the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only from doing the thing wrong enough times to finally do it right. The first lesson was the soil. Not every earth holds a ceiling. Two Stones woman pressed a handful of dirt between her palms, released it, watched how it crumbled. She pointed to a spot 20 feet left of where Wren had assumed they would dig. The composition there was different, more clay content, the kind that packs under pressure, instead of shifting the kind that will hold a roof beam through a Dakota winter without settling enough to crack the wall beside it. Wren could not feel the difference at first. She learned to feel it over 2 weeks of mornings crouching in the cold with both hands in the earth, reading it the way Silas had read metal, not by looking, but by contact, by the information the material was always broadcasting to anyone patient enough to receive it. The north face of this ridge was correct for reasons that compounded each other. The angle of the slope shed water in spring rather than channeling it toward the entrance. The aspect meant the sun never worked directly on the soil above the chambers, so the grass stayed thick and consistent season to season, betraying nothing beneath it. The permafrost line sat deeper on the north face, which meant the excavation could go lower before hitting ground that would not yield to a shovel. Every advantage fed into every other advantage, the way good structure works, each element doing its own job while reinforcing what surrounds it. Wren dug the first chamber alone. Two Stones woman watched, corrected the angle twice, told her where the south wall needed to step inward to distribute the load of the slope above it. The work was slower than any work Wren had done before, including the grave, because the grave had required only depth, while this required precision. And precision is a different kind of labor, one that punishes haste with consequences that appear days later when you have already moved on to the next problem. She hauled dirt out in a canvas sack looped across her shoulders, one load at a time, scattering it along the creek bed 200 yards away so that the displaced earth did not accumulate anywhere visible from the road. In 3 weeks, she moved more soil than she could calculate, her body keeping count in the only currency it recognized, which was damage. Her hands bled through the bandaging she changed each morning. The blisters that had started with the grave had evolved into something beyond blisters, into a general condition of rawness that she stopped attending to individually because there was no point distinguishing one injury from another when the whole apparatus was simply in a state of sustained use. She ate what she had slept when she could no longer stay upright, woke before light to begin again. The cold was a factor she worked with rather than against, using the frozen mornings to move timber from the deadfall 2 miles north, dragging logs across ground that was solid enough to slide on, because the alternative was waiting for mud season, when the same logs would mire in the earth and she would lose a month. The timber joints were where Two Stones woman's knowledge and Silas's legacy converged in Wren's hands. The framing system Two Stones woman had inherited from her mother used interlocking cuts, each beam notched to receive the next, the whole assembly holding through geometry rather than hardware. Wren had watched Silas use the same principle in metal for 3 years, the way a properly fitted joint becomes stronger under load, because the force itself drives the pieces together rather than working against the connection. She adapted the cuts, deepened the notches, slightly angled the interlocks to take advantage of the specific grain patterns in cottonwood, which runs differently than the timber Two Stones woman's family had traditionally worked with. The old woman watched these modifications without comment for 2 days. On the third day, she crouched beside a joint Wren had just finished, pressed it with both thumbs, rocked it against its load, and said nothing. The saying nothing was the approval. The ventilation was the most technically demanding element, a fired clay pipe running underground for 80 feet before emerging through the base of a dead cottonwood stump that Wren had hollowed out by hand over the course of a November week that left her right arm temporarily unable to lift above her shoulder. The pipe had to maintain a consistent slope of 3 degrees enough to draw air without creating a current strong enough to betray itself above ground. Too steep and the draw would whistle in certain wind conditions. Too flat and the chambers would fill with smoke faster than the fire could compensate. Two Stones woman dug the trench for the pipe herself, the one task she claimed without being asked, moving through the frozen ground with a speed that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with having done this specific thing before. By February, 4 months after the first shovelful, the main chamber stood 8 feet across and 6 feet high at center. The ceiling curved rather than flat, which was not aesthetics but engineering the arch, distributing the weight of the earth above it, in the same way a stone arch distributes the weight of the wall it supports. Two secondary chambers branched from it through low passages that followed the natural contours of the ridge, each positioned to catch the rising warmth from the main fire, each carved with sleeping platforms at the height where the warmest air settled. Storage alcoves ran along the east wall of the main chamber deep enough to hold 2 winters' worth of preserved food if 2 winters' worth could be obtained, which was the next problem after the structural one. Wren moved into the chambers on the 1st of March, 1883. The cabin above remained standing, its door hanging open, leaves beginning to accumulate on the floor. She took from it only what she could not fabricate underground: the iron cookpot, the almanacs, the small clock Silas had brought from Ohio. She left the furniture, the curtains, the mattress. She left the appearance of a home that had been abandoned in a hurry because the appearance of abandonment was now her primary strategic asset. The temperature inside the chambers that first night was 53 degrees, while the surface held at 8 above zero. She lay on the sleeping platform she had built using the joint system she'd developed over the winter, her body still wired for the work that had produced this place, her hands tightening against the cold that was not there. The earth pressed close on all sides, not claustrophobic, but present the way a held thing knows it is held. Above her, through 2 feet of packed soil and sod, and the root systems of the grass that would thicken over the entrance with each spring, the wind moved across the Dakota plain with its usual disregard. She was not safe, she understood that. The chambers were invisible, but invisible was only a condition, not a guarantee. The next step was making invisible hold. Harlan Voss came in April, the second week after the thaw made the roads passable. He brought Ogden a surveyor, 2 men with axes, and enough legal paperwork to transfer the claim to Voss Copper Holdings, pending the required 60-day abandonment period under territorial law. He also brought the death certificate, already completed except for the coroner's signature, which Ogden had obtained from a territorial coroner in Bismarck, who had not been to the claim and had no intention of visiting it, but who understood that professional relationships with men like Voss were worth maintaining. They worked the property for 2 days. The cabin was searched and documented as abandoned. The outbuildings were checked. The fence lines were walked. The creek bed was examined for evidence of recent use. The surveyors measured and marked the timber stands on the north ridge, noting with the careful neutrality of professionals hired for a specific purpose that the copper-bearing formation ran, as the geological report had indicated, directly beneath the north face and into the ridge proper. Wren lay in the main chamber and listened to footsteps above her head. She heard them cross the entrance 3 times without pausing, heard the surveyor's measuring chains scrape across the sod. Above the secondary chambers, heard Ogden's voice once directly overhead. Something about easement angles she caught only in fragments because the earth muffled the higher frequencies and left only the lower registers, the floor notes of human speech. She had extinguished the fire 2 hours before they arrived, working from instinct rather than calculation. The instinct of someone who had spent a winter underground learning how the land processed and released information. The chambers were cooling but still held enough warmth above the surrounding soil temperature that a thermometer at the surface would have registered a difference. No one brought a thermometer. Voss signed the death certificate standing on the sod above the main chamber, using Ogden's leather case as a writing surface. Wren heard the pen scratching through 2 feet of compacted earth, a sound so small it should not have been audible at all. But she had been underground for a month by then, and her hearing had already begun the long adjustment that would eventually allow her to feel a horse's hoofbeats from half a mile away. She heard the scratch of the pen. She breathed so slowly that the air in front of her face did not move. When they were gone, when the horse's hoofbeats had receded to nothing, and the silence above was the silence of open country rather than the silence of held breath, she climbed out through the entrance and walked to the cabin. The death certificate was nailed to the door with a fresh-cut tack below a hand-lettered sign on new board. Territorial land, no trespass, Voss, Copper Holdings. Her name was on the certificate. Silas's name was on it. Both of them accounted for, both of them filed away. She pulled the certificate from the door. She carried it back to the chambers, tucked it into a crack in the east wall where the firelight sometimes caught the ink. She kept it the way a soldier keeps a scar, not as a trophy, not as decoration, but as evidence of the thing that was supposed to end you preserved, because its failure is the only record you have that you survived it. The dogs came in April of 1884. A hunter named Brestwick brought them 3 liver-colored hounds with ears that swept the ground and noses calibrated by generations of breeding to distinguish between every scent the prairie produced. Voss did not come himself this time. He sent 2 men from his office along with Breswick, which told Wren something she filed away. He was not yet certain enough that she was alive to invest his personal presence in finding her. She had prepared for the dogs the previous night, working by feel in the dark, covering every footpath within 40 feet of the entrance with a layer of dead grass scraped from the far side of the ridge where her passage would not show. She mixed the contents of 4 small packets that Two Stones woman had left hanging in the storage alcoves before the previous winter plants, whose identity Wren did not know by name, but whose effects she had been told crushed wild bergamot, dried sagebrush pine resin, rendered liquid by heat, and then resolidified ground juniper berry. The combination rubbed into the soil around the entrance and scattered in a wide arc beyond it did not eliminate scent. It created noise. It overwhelmed the scent reading apparatus with competing signals until the picture the dog was trying to assemble became too fragmented to act on. The hounds worked for 6 hours. She heard them, their claws on the frozen thawed surface, their handlers' voices encouraging them in the specific vocabulary of men who work with dogs. Short words delivered in tones that convey expectations rather than commands. The dogs found the rabbit warrens in the lower field. They found the den where a pair of foxes had wintered under the creek bank. They found the place where Wren had 3 weeks earlier skinned a deer, though the evidence had been carefully scattered. They did not find Wren. The hounds sat down in the middle of the north field approximately 200 yards from the entrance, all 3 of them, and refused to continue. Not agitated, not alert, simply done in the way an animal is done when it has been asked to perform a task the conditions have made impossible. Breswick spent 40 minutes trying to restart them. The dogs lay on their sides in the thin spring sun with the expressions of creatures who have no more information to offer. Breswick told Voss's men, "Nothing alive out here except what belongs here." He packed up his dogs and left. Wren, lying in the main chamber directly below where the hounds had sat down, listened to the silence return in stages. First the men's voices, then the dogs' collars, then the horses, then the creek, then the wind. When the wind was all that was left, she exhaled a breath she had been holding for 20 minutes, and the air that came back in tasted like damp earth and wood smoke, and the specific quality of continued existence. Cole Murte arrived in September of 1885, riding a gray horse that moved quietly enough to have been trained for it. Wren did not see him arrive. She became aware of him the way she had become aware of Two Stones woman 3 years earlier, through the peripheral processing of someone who had learned to read the land at a resolution most people never develop. The grass moved wrong at the ridge's east edge wrong, in the specific way that meant something heavier than wind was working it. She watched through the ventilation gap for an hour before she identified him, a man sitting on the high point above the creek, not moving, not searching, just watching. He was there the next day, the day after that. He changed position each morning, working systematically around the claim's high points, the way someone works a problem from multiple angles. Not because any single angle will solve it, but because the angles together will reveal what no single one can. On the 4th day, he walked the perimeter in a pattern that was not a search pattern in the conventional sense. He was not looking for Wren. He was reading the land for the story it was telling, without meaning to the way all land tells stories if the reader knows the language. He noted the place where deer trails avoided the north ridge despite the superior grazing on its face. He noted the area where frost lingered 20 minutes past, when the surrounding terrain had already shed it. He noted the slight depression in the sod above the secondary chamber, 3 inches lower than the surrounding surface, which meant the earth had settled minimally over a void below. He noted the dead cottonwood stump 80 feet from the entrance and crouched beside it for a long time, pressing his palm flat against the wood, feeling for the faint warmth of air moving through the hollow interior. On the 5th day, he walked to the north ridge and placed his hand on the sod above the main chamber. Wren was preparing preserved venison when the shadow passed across the ventilation gap and did not move on. She stopped. She set the knife down without sound. The hand pressed against the grass above her head was not visible to her, but she felt the slight change in pressure transmitted through 2 feet of packed earth, the way you feel a door close somewhere else in a building, not the sound of it, but the shift in air. She did not move. She counted her own heartbeats, which she had learned to do during the dog search, because counting was the mind's way of staying in the present when the present was trying to become unbearable. She counted to 60, The pressure above her did not change. She counted to 100. He was still there. She reached for the blacksmith's hammer on its peg beside the sleeping platform, the hammer Silas had taught her to grip correctly. 4 fingers wrapped thumb alongside rather than over, so that the shock of impact travels along the hand rather than stopping at the wrist. She held it. She waited. At 131, the pressure lifted. Footsteps moved away from the entrance, deliberate and unhurried in the direction of the timberline. She heard Murtaugh's voice a few minutes later speaking to Voss's man, who had waited at the claim boundary. "She's gone. Most likely walked east in the early thaw. The land's clean." A pause. "No, I'm certain no one's been living here." The sound of horses diminishing east toward Ridge Creek. Wren did not emerge until full dark 3 hours later. She made her rounds in the way she always made them, checking the entrance seam, examining the surface above each chamber for any disturbance that needed correcting, reading the ground for the story it was currently telling. Near the east tree line where the cottonwoods began, she found what he had left. It was pushed into the soft earth at the base of a young cottonwood canted at a slight angle handle up. A cross-peen hammer, small, precise, a blacksmith's tool for setting rivets and marking exact points on metal before committing to the cut. The working face showed the polish of long, regular use, the kind of use that inscribes a tool with the memory of the person who used it. The handle was wrapped in oil-cured leather, worn smooth in the way that leather wears when the same hand has gripped it thousands of times. He had asked about Silas Calloway before he came. He had learned what Silas did. He had chosen this specific hammer from whatever collection of tools he owned or acquired, and he had pressed it into the ground at a specific angle with the handle pointing back toward the ridge, toward the chambers, toward the woman he had just confirmed was living in them. The message required no translation. It said, "I know what you are. I know who taught you to see what others miss. I am not going to say so." She pulled the hammer from the earth. She held it in the dark, feeling the weight of it, the balance, the warmth the metal had held from the day, and was releasing slowly into the October night. It was the first object she had received from the outside world in 2 years. She carried it back to the chambers and hung it on the peg beside the sleeping platform, where it would remain for years, the nearest thing she had to proof that she existed. The winter of 1886 killed Two Stones woman in her sleep. Wren found her on a March morning when the creeks were just beginning to open, walking to the old woman's place, with news about early plant growth, which shoots were appearing ahead of schedule, which roots would be ready to harvest within the month. Two Stones woman loved these details, the specific intelligence of the land, in transition, the way the world announced its intentions to anyone willing to read the announcement. Wren knocked on the entrance in their established pattern. No response. She knocked again. The silence that came back was different from absence. It was completion. She was lying on the sleeping platform with her hands folded across her chest, and her face holding the expression of someone who had finished a very long piece of work and set it down. Beside her on the platform was a small wooden carving of a bird wings caught mid-opening, not yet fully spread, frozen in the moment before flight rather than the moment of it. The wood had been handled so long and so often that the original edges of the carving had softened into something less like carved form and more like something grown. Wren understood without instruction that this was the last thing Two Stones woman had kept from before everything she'd kept from before had been taken. She buried her on the ridge above the chambers in the soil. Two Stones woman had taught her to read. She used a flat piece of Dakota limestone for the marker and cut into it with a chisel, working by feel to keep the letters shallow enough that they would look from any distance like natural weathering rather than inscription. 4 words she gave me: ground. Then she went back underground because there was nowhere else to go, and the thing that no one had warned her about began. It did not feel like grief. It felt like subtraction. Over the months following Two Stones woman's death, Wren noticed that things were disappearing from her interior life in the same way the old woman had disappeared from the exterior one, without announcement, without drama, simply ceasing to be present when she reached for them. The capacity for surprise went first, which was not a significant loss. Then the capacity for anticipation, which was more significant but manageable. Then in the winter of 1887, in the second week of February, during a night when a loose horse blundered across the property edge, and she killed her fire and lay in total darkness for 3 hours, while the animal worked its way around the claim's perimeter. She reached for the memory of Silas's face and found it had gone blurry at the edges in a way it had not been blurry before. She gripped the cross-peen hammer. She pressed her palm flat against the oil-cured leather wrapping and held it in the dark the way you hold something when you are trying to transfer its solidity into yourself. The face came back. Not fully, not with the clarity of the early years, but enough to confirm that it was still there, that she had not yet lost the thing that had kept her human through 4 winters of solitude. The specific face of a specific man who had said that a broken thing still holds, if you know where to put the weight, not knowing he was talking about everything. She lay in the dark for 3 hours, and in those 3 hours she did not think about Voss. She did not think about copper surveys or land certificates or the next season's food stores. She thought about the fact that she had not spoken to another human being in 11 months. She thought about how language works in isolation, how it begins to loosen from meaning when there is no one to use it with, how words that exist only in your own mind start to feel like objects whose purpose you can recall but can no longer quite demonstrate. She had been narrating her own days aloud to prevent this, a habit she had developed in the 3rd winter, and continued because it worked, because the sound of a human voice, even one's own, tethered something that otherwise drifted. But 11 months of speaking only to herself had begun to make the tether feel frayed. She mouthed Silas's name in the dark, then said it aloud, then said her own name, Wren Calloway. Wren Calloway. The words meant what they had always meant, but the meaning was maintained now by effort rather than by the natural reinforcement of being known by other people who used those words for her. She understood something that night that she had not let herself understand before. The danger was not Voss. The danger was the slow erosion of the person who had decided to survive until survival was all that remained, and the person who had decided on it had been replaced by a mechanism that performed the same functions without the interior life that made the functions worth performing. Hiding isn't living. Two Stone's woman had told her once during the early months of the construction. It's waiting. Wren had understood this as a practical observation at the time. She understood it now as a warning. Dottie Pierce broke in the summer of 1887, which Wren did not witness, but understood from what followed it. Voss had been patient. He had let 2 years pass since Murtaugh's report, letting the legal situation settle, letting the territorial court grow comfortable with the status of the claim as abandoned property pending final disposition. He had not pressed the court for action because pressing would have required explaining why abandoned land was proving difficult to formally transfer, which would have led to questions he preferred not to answer. He was waiting for the situation to resolve itself through time and paperwork, the way most situations in his experience eventually did. What changed his approach was a conversation at the Ridge Creek Land Office in July, something a clerk said about having seen Dottie Pierce twice near the Calloway claim boundary in the past season. This was true only in the sense that Dottie's route to the grain mill passed within sight of the claim's east edge, but Voss did not know enough of the geography to discount it. He summoned Dottie to the land office under the pretext of permit renewal for her water rights, and he put the unsigned revocation notice on the desk between them before she had finished sitting down. Dottie held for longer than Wren might have predicted. She held through the initial questioning, through the water permit discussion, through Voss's careful and unhurried recounting of how prior encumbrances worked and what happened to properties adjacent to properties in legal dispute when the dispute dragged on. What broke her was not a threat, but an observation. Voss said conversationally that it was remarkable a woman alone in Dakota Territory could simply vanish without leaving any trace at all, and that the most logical explanation was that someone who knew her must have had some information about her state of mind in the days before the winter that had presumably claimed her. Dottie said, before the snow came that first year, she told me she would never leave that ridge. Not for any man and not for any law. She understood immediately what she had done. The understanding arrived in her face before the sentence was fully out, the specific expression of someone who has watched their own hand do something they intended to prevent. Voss thanked her for her time. He did not touch the revocation notice. He left it on the desk when she went, which was worse than any explicit threat. The return of Cole Murtaugh confirmed what Wren had already deduced. He arrived in August, came in from the east, worked the property for 2 days without haste. On the afternoon of the second day, he walked to the north face of the ridge and stood on the sod above the main chamber. The summer made the evidence cleaner than it had been in the fall of his first visit. In winter, small differences in snow depth could be attributed to wind. In the dry August of 1887, the grass above the main chamber was 4 inches taller than the surrounding sod, nourished from below by warmth and the faint moisture of the ventilation system, and the difference in color green against the brown dry grass of late summer drew the eye in a way that winter cover did not. Murtaugh stood above it for a long time. Wren held the cross-peen hammer with both hands and pressed her back against the east wall of the main chamber and counted. She got to 240 before his footsteps moved away. She heard him speaking to whoever Voss had sent as an observer. "The land is abandoned. Whatever you're looking for isn't here." A silence. "I've surveyed this property twice now. If someone were living on it, I would know. No one is living on it." The observer asked a question she could not make out. Murtaugh's answer came back clean and final. "File your papers." She waited until the next morning to go out. Dawn, the light still gray, the August air, already carrying the first suggestion of what September would bring. She made her rounds. At the east fence line where her property bordered the territory road, she found a single boot print pressed deep into a patch of soft earth near the ditch, deliberate rather than incidental, positioned at an angle that pointed back toward the ridge. Above it, at knee height on a fence post, 3 horizontal scratches cut into the wood with a blade parallel lines of equal length spaced evenly. Not letters, not a map. A mark that said I was here. I saw. I'm not telling. In 1888, the territorial court rejected Voss's third filing. No body, no confirmed abandonment, no valid transfer. Voss stood in the courthouse and his voice carried something past frustration into a register that the judge found notable enough to record in the proceedings' margin notes. Murtaugh, present as the professional surveyor of record, placed his Pinkerton identification on the judge's table. Beside his written survey report stood and addressed Voss directly before leaving. "You can't own land that doesn't want to be owned, Harlan, and whoever is on that ridge wants it more than you do." He left Dakota Territory that afternoon and did not return. The mark on the fence post stayed through 7 winters. By the time the 8th one came, the weather had worked the cuts smooth enough that you would have had to know they were there to see them. But Wren knew they were there. She passed that fence post on her perimeter checks twice a month for years, and each time she passed it, she allowed herself exactly the same thing. The knowledge that one person in the world above had known she existed, had chosen that knowledge carefully, had done with it what integrity required rather than what his contract demanded. It was not company. It was not warmth. It was the narrowest possible thread connecting her to the species she still technically belonged to, and she held it because in the winters, when everything else was wearing thin, a thread is not nothing. A thread, if you know where to put the weight, is enough. The 8th winter came the way the worst ones always do. Not gradually, but all at once, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in 6 hours on the 14th of January, 1890, the wind shifting to due north and staying there with the locked determination of something that has made up its mind. Wren felt the change before she heard it, the barometric pressure dropping through the earth the way it always dropped before a serious storm, a tightening behind her eyes that she had learned to read as accurately as any instrument. She climbed to the ventilation gap and looked north. The horizon was gone. In its place stood a wall of white moving south at a speed that made the scale of it difficult to process, the kind of scale that reminds you the continent does not know you are on it. She sealed the entrance, stoked the fire to a steady burn that would hold without constant attention, checked her food stores with the automatic precision of someone who has been calculating survival margins for 8 years. She had enough for 6 weeks of solitary use. She had laid in more than usual this past autumn, some instinct she could not have named pushing her to take an extra deer to put up more dried corn from the small hidden gardens she kept in the ravine's sheltered eastern fold. She did not know why she had done more than her own need required. She would understand later that the body sometimes knows before the mind catches up. The storm screamed for a day, then another. She slept in intervals, woke to tend the fire, listened to the pressure waves moving through the earth above her. She had long since stopped fearing the storms themselves. What she had come to understand through 8 winters of underground living was that the earth does not participate in weather. The earth simply holds at 53 degrees patient as stone, while the surface does whatever the surface decides to do. It was on the morning of the 3rd day, with the wind still running at a pitch that made normal sound impossible on the surface, that she first heard the voices. She had learned to distinguish between sounds that originated above the chambers and sounds that traveled through the earth from greater distances. What she heard now came from directly overhead human voices, multiple the cadence of people moving in a group through difficult conditions. She pressed her palm flat against the ceiling timber and felt the vibration of footsteps transmitted through the frozen ground, heavier than the deer that sometimes cross the ridge, irregular in the way exhausted people walk, rather than the smooth pattern of people who still have reserves. She counted the step patterns she could feel. Many, too many to be Voss's survey teams, too many for any purpose except crisis. She moved to the ventilation gap, which in winter provided a narrow angle of vision at ground level. What she saw was a line of shapes moving through the white bent at the waist against the wind, wrapped in everything they owned moving, because stopping meant dying. She counted 12 she could see from the gap's limited angle. There were more beyond her sightline. Among them she recognized Voss. The width of his shoulders had not changed in 8 years, nor had the way he walked with the forward lean of a man accustomed to expecting the terrain to accommodate him, rather than the other way around. He was moving the same direction as everyone else, which meant the storm had stripped him of whatever distinction his position had previously provided. Among the figures she also recognized Dottie Pierce, by the way she held her body curved inward, and to the left protecting something she carried against her chest. The bundle was the right size for a small child. She heard over the next 2 hours the group cross the ridge twice more. Each time the voices were fewer in number, which meant people were going down, or the group was spreading out and losing cohesion, which in these conditions amounted to the same outcome. She tracked the sound of a man's voice each time arguing against the wind, insisting on direction and continuation, when the easier choice was to stop. She would learn later that this was Eli Hatch, but she did not know his name yet. She knew only that someone up there understood that forward was the only option, that the argument for stopping was always available and always wrong. Then the fourth crossing. The group's pace had slowed to something that was barely walking more a controlled fall in the correct direction. She heard the man's voice again, hoarser now, the argument reduced to single words because full sentences cost energy the speaker no longer had. She heard children. She heard the particular sound of adult voices trying to maintain a tone that children could not read as despair. Then she heard the child. She would not be able to describe it afterward in any way that conveyed what it actually was. It was not loud. It was not even what most people would recognize as crying. It was the sound a very small body makes when it has moved through fear and exhaustion and cold into the territory beyond all three, a thin, continuous sound, like something wearing out like a mechanism running on the last of whatever it was built to run on. Wren knew this sound. She had heard it from animals. She had understood it then for what it was, the final audible evidence of a life in the act of ending. She reached for the cross-peen hammer on its peg. Her fingers closed around the oil-cured leather handle, the indentations worn into it by her own grip over 5 years of daily contact. She held it the way she had held it through the dog search, through Murtaugh's visits, through the long February nights when her own name had needed to be spoken aloud to remain real. She held it as though it were an argument she was making to herself, pressing the case for something she had not yet decided. She thought about two Stones woman's hands on a cottonwood beam in the first winter of construction. The patience in them, the knowledge they carried without effort, because knowledge held long enough becomes indistinguishable from instinct. She thought about what the old woman had said, that hiding was not living, but waiting, and that the difference between the two was the door you kept locked from the inside. She thought about Silas at the barn hinge, the broken bolt, the repair that required understanding where the weight actually went, rather than where you assumed it should go. He had been talking about the hinge. He had been talking about this moment 8 years later without knowing it. She set the hammer down. She lifted the timber bar from its brackets. She set her shoulder against the door and pushed. The cold hit her face with a force that was not temperature, but impact, the physical fact of wind that had been building across 500 miles of open plain before meeting the first solid object in its path, which was now Wren Calloway's face. She had not felt full winter on her skin in 8 years. Her body's response was total and immediate, every surface nerve firing at once. The light was the second shock. After 8 years of lamplight and firelight, in the thin filtered gray that came through the ventilation gap, the white expanse of the storm was blinding in the specific way that forces the eyes shut and makes the world orange-red through closed lids. She forced them open through will rather than comfort. The group was 40 feet away, moving south already past her, already beyond the point where most of them would have seen the door, even if they had been looking for it. Eli Hatch was at the back of the line because that was where he had positioned himself, where you could see everyone ahead of you, where the slowest people were most likely to be where someone needed to be, who had made the decision that no one got left. He was carrying the child on his back. He was holding a woman's arm with his right hand. His left arm was held slightly away from his body, which meant it had stopped responding to the cold, in the way that limbs stop responding when they have been told enough times that the situation is not survivable. He turned. Later he would say that he did not hear anything, that he had no rational reason to turn at that moment. What he saw was the hillside open, a seam appearing where no seam had been visible, a door swinging outward on well-maintained hinges, warm yellow light falling across the snow in a shape that the storm immediately began to erase. A woman stood in the opening. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the child on his back. Her expression when she looked at the child was the expression of someone who has just heard the thing that changes the calculation. "Come in." Her voice was level, not loud-pitched, with the instinctive accuracy of someone who understood exactly how far sound would travel in these conditions. "There's room for all of you." He turned toward the rest of the group without hesitation because there was nothing to decide. "Here," he said, "move toward me, all of you." They came. Some walked, some were carried. Some crawled the last few feet on hands and knees through the snow because their legs had given out and their arms still worked, and there was warm light coming from the ground itself, which their frozen minds processed as impossible, but their bodies moved toward anyway, because the body always knows before the mind catches up. Wren stood at the entrance and directed them through, counting as they passed, pressing her hand briefly against each person's back as they entered, the touch automatic rather than intentional, the gesture of someone confirming that each one is real. Harlan Voss was the last one through the door. He stopped at the threshold. He stood in the entrance with the storm at his back and the warm chambers before him, and he looked at the woman who had handed him the accounting of 8 years in a single glance. His face showed something that did not have a name in the vocabulary he had built his life around, the expression of a man who has organized his entire existence around a set of beliefs about how the world works and has just walked into evidence that every one of them was wrong. "You're alive." The words came out stripped of everything, no authority in them, no calculation. Just the fact stated as though he needed to hear himself say it to confirm it was true. Wren looked at him without flinching. "I've always been alive. You just couldn't find me." He stepped inside. She closed the door behind him, replaced the timber bar, turned to the work of managing 23 people in a space built for one. The first night was pure triage. Wren assessed damage with the systematic attention of someone who has spent years evaluating conditions rather than reacting to them. 3 cases of frostbite requiring immediate warming done gradually, because rapid rewarming causes damage that slow rewarming prevents. 2 people showing the disorientation of hypothermia that had progressed past, shivering into the dangerous calm that follows it. Dottie's youngest, the child Wren had heard through the earth, was cold through, but conscious, her color returning, as Wren wrapped her in the blanket from the sleeping platform closest to the main fire. The child looked at Wren with the unguarded attention of very young children who have not yet learned to pretend they are not studying someone. Dottie Pierce held her daughter with both arms and did not look at Wren for the first 3 hours. When she finally looked up, the guilt on her face had the settled quality of something that had been living there for a long time. Wren met her eyes without expression and went back to work, because there were 23 people in a space designed for one, and the management of that situation was a full-time occupation that did not leave room for the other conversation, the one that would have to happen eventually, but could wait until no one was in immediate danger of dying. Eli Hatch moved through the chambers behind her, not following but observing, filing away everything he saw with the attention of a craftsman encountering work he doesn't fully understand yet. He examined the ceiling joints the way you examine good work, running a thumb along the seam, testing the fit, feeling for the relationship between the pieces. He found the cross-peen hammer on its peg and stood looking at it for a moment before moving on. He did not ask questions. He watched Wren work and stayed out of her way, and when something needed doing that was within his capacity to do, he did it without being told. On the second day, a man named Cobb moved to the storage alcove and began removing dried venison without acknowledgement of whose food it was. Eli's hand closed around his wrist before he had transferred the second piece. This is her house. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who is not making an argument but stating a condition. You ask before you take. Cobb looked at the hand on his wrist. He looked at the room full of people whose survival was directly contingent on the woman who had stocked these alcoves. He put the venison back and asked. Wren rationed the food with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years calculating exactly how much she needed, now running those calculations for 23 instead of 1. It was a different kind of arithmetic, but the same discipline: what exists, what is required, how to make the gap between those two numbers close enough to survive. Voss sat against the north wall of the main chamber through most of the first 3 days in the coldest available spot, as far from the other survivors as the architecture permitted. He had not been to the coldest spot by accident. Wren understood this without being told. He was putting himself in the place that cost him something. The way men who understand they owe a debt sometimes seek out discomfort because it is the only currency they currently have to pay with. On the third night, Dottie Pierce waited until the chambers were quiet with the specific silence of exhausted people sleeping, then moved across the floor to where Wren sat by the fire, doing the mental calculations she did every evening. Dottie sat beside her and looked at the fire. She did not speak for several minutes. The fire was patient. I knew, Dottie said. When we were walking over this ridge all 4 times, I knew what was under my feet. Her voice was barely above the fire's level. You told me not to tell anyone. I kept that. But I kept it while people were dying out there. Wren looked at the fire. She let the silence hold long enough to be honest rather than comfortable. You didn't let anyone die, she said. I opened the door. That was my decision, not yours. I should have helped you. In the beginning, when you asked me to witness, I should have said yes and let him take the water rights. The true answer required more time than honesty usually gets. You had 3 children, Wren said finally. You made the choice you could make. Dottie's hand moved across the floor and rested on Wren's arm. Wren looked at it. She did not pull away. The weight of another person's hand on her arm after 8 years of no voluntary human contact was a sensation that her nervous system did not have a current category for, something that lived between comfort and alarm, something that would need time to resolve into one or the other. She let it stay. The fire burned. The storm ran itself against the sod above them, like something trying to get in the way. Things always try to get through surfaces that are built to hold. On the 7th day, Eli found Voss in the narrow passage between the main chamber and the first secondary room. Voss was sitting with his back against the earth wall, his legs straight out, looking at the ceiling, with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he cannot put back on the shelf. Eli sat down beside him, the way you sit beside someone when you are not there to comfort them, but to witness, because some things only become real when another person is present for them. Eli looked at the ceiling joints, the interlocked cottonwood, the geometry that needed no hardware because it understood weight. She built all of this herself. Not a question, a statement directed at the ceiling rather than at Voss, the kind of statement that invites a response without requiring one. Voss was quiet long enough that the fire in the main chamber went through a full cycle of settling before he spoke. I signed 4 death certificates. His voice had lost every professional quality it had ever possessed. What remained was just the voice itself, the mechanical fact of a man producing words. 4 times I swore before God and the territorial court that this woman was dead. I stood on this roof and signed the papers. He paused. The passage's earth walls held the sound of his breathing. She was 30 feet below my boots, and I signed the papers. Eli did not offer absolution. Some confessions are not petitions. They are simply the act of saying the true thing out loud in the presence of another person, and the person's role is not to respond, but to remain to be the witness the speaking requires. The copper vein, Voss said after a while, it was never worth what I told the Philadelphia investors it was worth. I needed the land to make the numbers work, so I made the numbers work first before I had the land. That's the order things happen in when you've been doing it long enough. You build the story, then you find the facts to fit it. Another pause. There weren't enough facts. Eli said nothing. Outside, the storm made its sounds. Inside, the earth held its temperature. The storm broke on the 9th day, the wind dropping between midnight and dawn, from a scream to a whisper to nothing. The silence that followed was so complete that people woke from it jerked out of sleep by the absence of the sound they had been sleeping through for over a week. Wren was already awake. She had been awake for 2 hours, lying on the sleeping platform she had not used except in intervals since the group arrived, listening to the storm subtract itself element by element. When the last of it was gone, she waited another 20 minutes, then lifted the timber bar from the door. The snow outside the entrance had drifted to 6 feet, packing the seams solid enough that she had to push through it rather than swing the door. She went out through the snow the way you go through any resistance, steadily, without forcing, letting the weight of your body do the work, so that the effort remains sustainable. She broke through into air so cold it registered in her lungs as a physical substance, something to be processed rather than simply breathed. The world the storm had left behind was absolute. Every surface covered, every edge buried, the landscape reduced to a series of smooth white curves that bore no visible relationship to the terrain beneath them. The sky was the deep, impossible blue that appears only after the worst weather, as though the violence had scoured the atmosphere down to its true color. She stood in it for a moment, fully exposed for the first time in over a week, the cold on her face, the familiar fact it had been her whole life before the years underground. She had missed this. She had not known she had missed it until it was on her face again. The cold specificity of winter air that carries information the way no other medium does, the distance to the tree line, the direction of the creek, the temperature of the ground relative to the temperature of the surface, all of it arriving at once through exposed skin. The survivors came out one by one, blinking, shielding their eyes, stepping into the snow with the cautious movements of people who have been returned to a world they had made certain preparations to leave. The children came out more directly than the adults, as children always do. Dottie's youngest stood in the snow and turned her face up to the blue sky with an expression of pure, uncomplicated reception, taking the world in through every available surface. Eli Hatch came out and stood beside Wren without speaking. He looked at the ridge above the entrance, at the way the snow lay on it, at the subtle depression in the surface that marked the secondary chambers, at the cottonwood stump 80 feet away, that was to a careful eye very slightly warmer than the snow around its base. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he looked at Wren. "You built the joints like a blacksmith." His voice was matter of fact, the voice of a man reporting an observation rather than paying a compliment. Wren looked at the ridge. "My husband was a blacksmith." "I know." He let that sit for a moment. "I asked around about him before I came up here. After the storm started and they needed volunteers." He paused. "I wanted to know who built what I was looking for." She turned to look at him directly for the first time. He met her eyes without any of the discomfort that direct looking usually produced in people who did not know how to be looked at. He had the face of someone who had spent his working life attending to things that required full attention, each feature doing its intended work. "You didn't know you were looking for this," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I knew I was looking for something worth finding." The territorial hearing convened in Ridge Creek on the second Tuesday of March, 1890. The chamber was the largest room in the courthouse building, which was not large, so the people who could not fit inside stood at the two windows and the open door, their breath fogging in the cold that came through every gap. The surviving members of the rescue party were there. Half the township was there. The story had moved through the territory faster than any newspaper could have carried it, the story of the door in the hillside, the woman dead for 8 years who was not dead, the commissioner who had signed her death certificate standing on her roof. Voss stood before the territorial judge with the stillness of someone who has decided what he is going to do and has organized himself around the decision. He did not have the appearance of a man who had been forced into this. He had the appearance of a man who had arrived at something slowly and at considerable cost, and was now delivering what he had arrived at. He produced the original loan document. He laid it on the judge's table. He explained in the measured language of a man who has spent his life in legal proceedings and knows exactly what precision requires that the mineral extraction clause in the document's final paragraph had been inserted after Silas Calloway's signature was obtained in different ink by a hand that was not Silas Calloway's. He knew this because he had directed the insertion. He had been present when it was done. He was prepared to state this under oath and to provide the name of the attorney who had performed the work, who was Prentice Ogden, who had died of influenza in Bismarck in 1888, which simplified certain aspects of the admission while leaving the central fact unchanged. Voss said that he had filed 4 death certificates for Wren Calloway between 1883 and 1889, that none of them were supported by evidence he believed to be credible, that he had known after the first year that the claim was almost certainly still occupied, that he had hired a tracker named Cole Murtaugh, who had confirmed the occupation and reported otherwise, and that he had accepted Murtaugh's false report because it served his purposes. He said he had caused the isolation of a widow through the systematic application of his office's influence over every institution she might otherwise have appealed to. He said he had done all of this for a copper deposit that the Philadelphia investors had already withdrawn funding from in 1888 after their own geological survey concluded the vein was smaller and shallower than his original report had indicated. He said finally that the land described in the original homestead filing, all 160 acres of the Callaway claim, should be returned to the title of Wren Callaway by order of the court clear of all encumbrances, with the fraudulent mortgage instrument voided. He looked at the judge when he said this, rather than at Wren, because he understood that looking at Wren during his own confession would have been a way of making the confession about her reaction rather than about the facts themselves. The judge asked Wren if she wished to speak. She had been standing at the edge of the room near the window, which was where she had positioned herself, because rooms full of people still required adjustment, the social density of the world above ground, something she was relearning in increments. She walked to the front of the room. She looked at Voss. His face showed the particular emptiness of a man who has put down something very heavy and does not yet know what to do with his hands. She thought about the barn hinge, about the bolt that sheared because something had been wrong from the start and had simply finally given out, about the principle of weight distribution, the idea that a broken thing holds when you understand where the force actually wants to go. My husband said a broken thing still holds if you know where to put the weight, she said. He was fixing a hinge when he said it. Turns out he was talking about everything. She turned away from Voss. She looked at the room, at the people who had spent 9 days in her chambers at Dottie Pierce in the second row with her daughter on her lap, at Eli Hatch near the door, with his coat folded over one arm, watching her with the patient attention he gave to things that required understanding before they required response. She looked at all of them and understood something that 8 years underground had prepared her for, without telling her it was preparing her for it. She had built a home in the earth because the world above had given her no place in it. She had made herself invisible because visibility would have destroyed her. She had survived by becoming exactly what the land itself is present beneath the surface, holding warmth that no one looking at the surface could see, patient in the way that things are patient when they have no choice but to wait. She had done all of this alone, which had been necessary, which had cost her things. She was still in the process of taking inventory of which she would not have done differently given the circumstances. The circumstances had changed. Anyone who wants to learn what I know, she said, I'll teach. The earth holds warmth, the surface never shows. It held me for 8 years. She looked at the window, at the blue sky beyond it, at the light that was still too much, but was becoming less too much every day. It can hold all of us. Eli Hatch came back in April, 6 weeks after the hearing, with a canvas bag of tools over one shoulder. He stood at the entrance to the chambers and looked at the door frame with the measuring eye of someone who has been thinking about a structural problem for a month. That frame needs reinforcing, he said. The left upright is taking uneven load. Give it 2 more winters and you'll have drift. Wren leaned against the door frame and considered this. Nobody said it needed reinforcing. No, he agreed, but I'd like to do it anyway. He came the following week and the week after. He reinforced the left upright, then replaced a sleeping platform whose supports had developed a hairline crack that Wren had not noticed. Then carved new shelving for the storage alcoves with joints that were better than what she had built, fitted with the patient precision of a craftsman who had found work that interested him. He did not talk much while he worked. Wren had discovered in his week in the chambers after the storm that his silence had a different texture from the silence she had been living in for 8 years. Her silence had been the silence of absence. His was the silence of someone entirely present, occupied without being distant quiet, because the work had his attention. She grew accustomed to the sound of his tools. She grew accustomed to the weight of his footsteps on the floor, which she had cataloged the way she had cataloged every footstep for 8 years, but which she cataloged differently now, the way you catalog something you are keeping rather than something you are monitoring. He stayed through the night for the first time in June, because the work ran past dark and the road back to Ridge Creek was not worth navigating by lamplight, and Wren did not ask him to leave. They ate dried venison by the fire without speaking much. Outside, the summer moved across the ridge with the quality of summer that follows hard winters, more vivid than it should be, as though the light knows it is working against the memory of 6 weeks of white. He did not move in through any announcement. He moved in the way water moves into low ground gradually by finding the natural path occupying space that had room for it. By August, he had a peg for his own tools beside the one that held the cross-peen hammer. By September, his reading patterns had begun to appear on the almanac's pages alongside Wren's own notations. Different handwriting, same observations. The record of two people paying attention to the same land from the same location. They married the following spring on the ridge above the entrance with 6 witnesses. No minister, the land itself the only authority either of them required. Dottie Pierce was among the witnesses. She stood in the back of the small group with her youngest daughter on her hip, and her eyes read from something that was not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood. The complicated feeling of being present at a good thing while carrying the full weight of what you failed to do to prevent the bad thing that preceded it. Wren caught her eye during the brief ceremony and held it long enough for Dottie to understand that the holding was intentional, that it meant something, that the distance between them was not closed, but was closing the way Earth closes around a seed slowly from all sides, because that is the only way anything actually holds. A saddlebag arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1905, delivered by a postal rider who said only that it had come through the Bismarck office with routing instructions and no return address. Inside was a leather journal, the pages filled with careful handwriting in ink that had faded uniformly, the sign of writing done over years rather than weeks. The journal contained descriptions of earth shelter construction methods, documented with the precision of someone who had made a long study of the subject, traveling through the territory, speaking to people who still built the old way, recording what they knew before it was gone. The drawings were architectural, detailed, the kind of drawings made by someone who understood structures from the inside. On the inside front cover in handwriting, Wren recognized from the scratches on a fence post she had passed twice a month for years was a single line for the ridge, CM. She sat for a long time with the journal in her hands in the main chamber beside the fire Eli had banked before going out to check the winter fence lines. The cross-peen hammer hung on its peg. Beside it on the shelf Eli had built sat the small wooden bird. 2 stones woman had kept beside her in death wings, caught mid-opening, not yet fully spread, frozen in the moment before flight. The journal went on the shelf beside it. 2 objects from people who had chosen her survival when they had no obligation to do so, kept together because what they represented was the same thing, the knowledge that even in the most complete invisibility, someone knew you were there. Wren Calloway died in the spring of 1926 in the main chamber on the sleeping platform Eli had rebuilt 3 times over the years because the original wore out and each replacement was better than the one it replaced. She was 70 years old. She had lived in the chambers she built by hand for 43 years, through seasons that had accumulated past counting, through the changes that Dakota Territory, becoming South Dakota, had brought, through the changes that the centuries turning had brought, through the changes that time brings to everything without asking permission. Eli buried her on the ridge beside 2 stones woman in the soil. Both women had understood in ways that most people never stopped to learn. He carved the marker himself because his hands needed to be doing something when words would not serve. He did not write her name, which felt insufficient. He did not write dates, which felt beside the point. He cut 5 words into the Dakota limestone with the careful deliberation of a man who had been thinking about the right words for a long time. The door is still open. The mark on the post at the east fence line, 3 horizontal scratches at knee height, had long since been smoothed by weather into the wood itself. The cabin above the old homestead site had fallen decades before. The copper company that Voss had once promised to Philadelphia investors never materialized, the vein having proved exactly as shallow as the second survey had indicated. The land remained what it had always been: grass and ridge and creek, and the particular quality of light that comes in low from the southwest in September and turns everything the color of something about to change. The door in the north face of the ridge remained maintained through each decade by hands that had learned the work from other hands, the chain of teaching extending forward through Wren's children and their children, carrying the knowledge that 2 stones woman had carried from before it, the understanding that the earth keeps its temperature regardless of what the surface does, that beneath every storm that tries to erase you, there is ground holding steady, patient as the continent itself, waiting for whoever needs it to find the entrance and knock.